there's a first time for everything. A first kiss, your first car, the unrequited first love. However, what does this mean in the grand scope of things? Are firsts more monumental because they are the first, or do we get better with practice? Do we remember our first as more important than they actually were, holding on to that magical moment as a mark of our past and future selves? Do our firsts outshine what comes next? On A First Time for Everything, we will explore with our guests their firsts and how those impacted the seconds, thirds, and even countless times after. Is the first the best or merely the beginning? Or worse, was the first the last because it was so bad? We will dig into the recesses of our memories and consider whether or not a first was the start of something amazing or something we'd rather not remember. Come along with me, Juliet Rose, as I put our guests in the hot seat to analyze their first and how they defined who they became. I promise you're in for a fun, although maybe bumpy ride. Hello, everyone. How are you doing tonight? This is Juliet Rose bringing another season of A First Time for Everything back. And as you guys know, this is, I think, actually season 3, but it says season 2. I'm not 100% sure. We'll figure that out. However, a lot of you know I am also an author, and I'm really happy to host this podcast. And I thank Joe and GoIndie Now for giving me this opportunity. And we welcome you back to another season. It should be a fun season. We're going to do things a little bit differently. I was just telling our guest tonight that I got rid of the wheel only because I ran out of ideas to put on the wheel. So we might figure out something else. But in the meantime, we're just going to go with this. So I'd like to introduce our guest tonight, who's Samantha Bryant. And Samantha, will you tell us a little bit about what you write and where people can find you?
Absolutely. Hi, guys. I'm Samantha Bryant. I am a speculative fiction writer who lives in North Carolina. I always say I was born in Kentucky, I live in North Carolina, and I left my heart in Alaska. I write, well, I'm best known for the Menopausal Superhero series, which is my series of novels. I literally just finished it. I stopped working on the edits to come record this show for the 5th and final book, which will come out from Falstaff Books this summer. So I'm super excited because that's the first time I've completed a series. And so that's a joy in my life. And then I also write short stories, mostly because I'm cheating on my novels or because somebody had a really interesting prompt I couldn't just resist. I'm maybe just a little bit addicted to writing for anthologies for the dopamine rush. And so I love writing short stories because it lets me play with so many different kinds of genres and styles and ideas, but at a lower commitment than taking on a novel. And so it's I consider short stories where I play when the work starts to feel too much like work.
Yeah, definitely. I can relate to that. I'm a little bit of an anthology writer, and I do short stories as well. So yeah, I feel like that's I always call them like breathers. Like it's easier to like complete it in a shorter time. I feel like you can breathe through it. So actually, out of curiosity, where in North Carolina?
Hillsborough?
Yeah, I know North Carolina well. I actually,
Oh,
in my childhood, I ping-ponged back and forth between New York and North Carolina. So I lived in Wilmington. I've lived in
okay.
Raleigh. I've spent time outside of Highlands in the mountains. Then my husband was military. We were in Fayetteville. So yeah, Winston-Salem. Yeah, I kind of Greensboro. I've been everywhere pretty
Yeah,
much.
you do know a lot of North Carolina. That's so
I do. I
cool.
love North Carolina. It's a great state. So yeah. And you said you're where now?
I'm in Hillsborough now.
You're here, and then okay. Yeah.
Right, but I grew up in Kentucky, 4 blocks from Ohio.
Okay. Yeah. That it's interesting. Like a lot of people don't realize that I'm doing research on a book, how close like areas of Ohio, Kentucky, West Virginia all kind of come together in certain areas. So that's really
Right,
cool.
I live closer to downtown Cincinnati than a lot of people with a Cincinnati address. I used to walk to Reds games.
That's really cool. That's really
Yeah.
cool. So I'm really curious. I was looking at the cover of your book, and I love the cover. First of all, that's really cool. What inspired you to write a menopausal superhero? So you said menopausal superhero?
Hmm. So I've been a superhero fan my whole life. Like, starting before I could read with Spidey on the Electric Company and Mighty Mouse and all of those guys. And eventually what happened is I got older. It was very disappointing to me too, I know. But and as I got older, I was a lot less connected to like teenage superhero characters. I don't know, they just left me annoyed as often as they left me thrilled. And I was like, you know what? Nobody ever writes a grown-up superhero with responsibilities, with jobs, somebody who has to be in the car riders line at 3:30 and can't just miss leave their kid stranded so that they can go learn to manage their new superpowers. And so I think the idea was literally after watching one of the X-Men movies, which, the secret message in a lot of X-Men stories is puberty will give you superpowers. And I was talking to my husband afterwards, and I made a joke about how if puberty would give you superpowers, that means it's hormonal and that menopausal women should have the corner on that market. And he laughed and told me I should write it. And here, 10 years later, I've now written 5 novels, 2 novellas, and a bunch of short stories for it.
That's really cool. So I'm really curious to hear about your reception for it because it's such a unique idea. Is it something that people are immediately like, "Oh, this is awesome," or does it like something people have to warm up to, or really what kind of feedback do you get?
Well, superhero fiction is pretty niche as it is,
Yeah.
right? It's just it's not like romance novels or urban fantasy where it's ever going to have a super giant following. So that's the first thing. And then people react differently. It just kind of depends. Like when I have it up on the table and people are walking past me at an event, um I can see for some people that the word menopause gives them pause. and and that's men and women. You'll get either kind of a disgusted face like, "Ooh, let's not talk about that,"
How dare
or
you?
or some women will tell me like, "Oh, been there, done that, don't want to go back again." But
Yeah.
then, other people just laugh. They're like, "Oh, that's wonderful." And then they'll pick it up to read the cover. And, that more delighted surprise kind of reaction, of course, is what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, and
And,
I love yeah, I
I get
love
good praise from people who've read
yeah,
it.
I love it because it is one of the things that I think, it does kinda make people chuckle and then like, "Oh, well, let me look at it because it's so unique. Like, when I first looked at it, I was like before you came in, I was reading the titles, like, going through the change. I'm like, "I relate to that very well right now, just so you know, like, that's where I'm at in my life." And I was like, "Huh, that is like" I mean, to put those 2 together is incredible. I love it. So is this you said it's novellas and novels. Is it graphic novel? Like, are there images too, or
No,
is it
these
a
are just
story?
prose.
Okay, okay. Yeah, yeah,
I
very
I have
cool.
I have no visual art skill at
Yeah.
all.
That's really I love it. I really do. I think that's such a great idea, and I love that you did it because I think a lot of times we have these ideas and we're afraid they're too niche, right? We're like, "Oh,
Mhm.
well, people aren't gonna like that," or "I really won't have a following," and I think what we tend to do when we do this, we talk ourselves out of our own creativity, and I love that you didn't do that you talked yourself into your own creativity and did something, just remarkable,
Well, thank
with
you.
yeah, I really I am impressed. Like, and it takes a lot for me to get impressed, but I tend to see and I hear people say, "Oh, well, you gotta write something that's mass market. You gotta write something that everybody's gonna read," and it drives me crazy because I'm really drawn to stuff that's extremely unique. And I love to see literature that does that because I feel like we could very easily fall into the abyss of that repetitive story,
Well,
and
I feel like
everyone
that's the joy of more independent publishing. Like, I work with Falstaff Books to do these, which is a small
nice.
independent
Yeah,
publisher. Kind of big for a small publisher
yeah,
actually.
yeah.
But and when you look at their catalog, it's wild, right? There's a great variety and stories that would have a hard time getting told in the bigger traditional published markets. And I'm actually finding that I read less and less from the mainstream big five presses because I've read all that already. They're just telling the same story again.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, it's interesting because 'cause I'm a librarian, and, a lot of times, because we don't carry as much indie, it's hard to get the indie into the library. And I'll have people come up and they'll ask recommendations, and I want to be like, I have a whole list for you. We just don't have it here, because we have very mainstream. And every once in a while, like I do try to stay current with even mainstream simply because I am a librarian. And I feel the same way. A lot of times I'm reading books and I think, nah, y'all have nothing on indie publishing. Like
Right.
it's all, I feel like churned out, same story. And especially certain authors, I feel like they're literally churning out the same story, just swapping names and maybe slight details. Whereas like indie authors they never say never. If they have an idea and they want to run with it, they do. Even if it's an idea that's maybe going to challenge people's comfort levels, like maybe this does, like you said, you get faces from people who walk by. Challenge those comfort levels. That's amazing. So that kind of actually leads into a question I have because one of the questions I really wanted to ask is because we're talking about first is who was the first person who really inspired you?
As a writer,
As anything, like, who was the first time when you were little you and something you said, "That's who I wanna be," or that made gave you the feeling, you know what I'm saying?
mhm. That's a tough one. I had a lot of strong women who were big influences on me in my youth. My mother, my grandmother, and my great grandmother were all super important to me in those early years. And my great grandmother was a scary old lady. She was just so intimidating, so intense, and I really wanted to be her because I was a cute little freckle-faced kid. People told me all the time that I looked like Laura Ingalls Wilder, right? For Little House on the Prairie. I even had the long braids, right? So, nobody was scared of me, right? And I wanted to be intimidating in a good way. I wanted people to feel like they, not that they had to hide from me, but that they would have to prove themselves to me.
Yeah, yeah, do you think that did you or do you now feel like maybe you were introverted and that was part of it, or what do you feel like kind of brought you to that place when you were a child?
Well, I'm definitely really introverted and I've always been quiet. Like I don't have a loud voice. Considering that I was a teacher for so many years, I don't have one of those shut down the classroom screams. you know. Um, and I have quiet habits. The things I like to do are reading and writing and, sitting here cuddling my dog. And especially as a Gen X kid, people seemed to think that that meant that I was shy and that I needed to be cured of being shy, that, shyness is a disease you need to get over. And I never felt like I was shy or it wasn't that I had social anxiety. It's just that if you were boring, I wasn't interested in talking to you. This book is way better
Yeah,
than another conversation about my sneakers.
yeah.
you know?
Totally relatable. I was that same child. And I always say, they're like,
Yeah,
"You're so shy. You just need to." And I was like, "But I don't want to. Like, I'm happy with where I'm at and who I am. Like, this isn't a problem for
exactly.
me. It's a problem for
And
you.
and
It's not a
and
problem
my
for me."
grandma Lena actually really liked me because I was quiet, and when I talked, I said something of interest.
Nice.
Yeah.
Now I'm curious, what did you teach?
Well, I taught for 27 years
Wow.
across 5 states. So, across all of that, I taught mostly English and Spanish classes to kids as young as 6th grade and, all the way through high school, and occasionally some community college, creative writing classes at the community college.
That's
I was a
wonderful.
music teacher for a few minutes, that was funny.
Oh, yeah.
I already mentioned Alaska, so I spent my 20s in Alaska. I had always wanted to go, and when I graduated college, I went. And, a lot of the schools in Alaska are very, very small. And, one of the schools I taught at was called Kenny Lake, and, it's in a homesteading community of about 400 people, K through 12, 100 students,
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
So every teacher there taught, like, 6 things.
Right, yeah.
Right, and so I taught a lot of English, a lot of Spanish, computers. I think I did yearbook that year, or maybe it was a journalism class. It's been a few years. But I also taught music because I can play the piano a little and I like to sing. That made me qualified.
There you go. That's how it works in small towns. I used to live, I raised my kids briefly for about 6 years out in Nebraska in a very small town of 1,000 people. So very similar. I know exactly what you're talking about. You did sports, you did everything, so yeah.
Right. Yeah, I was technically the hockey coach.
Oh, yeah.
Well, a co-hockey coach because it was a co-ed team and they needed a woman to travel with them.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
So my coaching was that I traveled with them and handed out water bottles.
So you were mentioning you taught Spanish, so obviously you are bilingual. Do you weave that into your stories?
I do. In the menopausal superheroes, one of the main heroes is Leonel Alvarez, who's Mexicana at the beginning, Mexicano later. There's another kind of change that happens to Leonel.
Very nice, very nice.
Yeah.
That's really cool. And then are your books available in Spanish as well? Do you
No, they've not been fully translated. But Leonel and David, his husband, speak Spanish to each other. I usually try to do that trick where you try to make it clear from context for somebody who can't read Spanish what
Mhm.
it meant.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Versus
Yeah.
just translating it exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Very cool. So, okay, so going on back to the first, so I have this kind of series of questions. So we talked about who first inspired you for just anything. So let's talk about who first inspired you for writing or what inspired you for writing.
Um, so reading, I think, is an entry point for a lot of people when it comes to writing. I feel like writing is kind of like reading on steroids. You know, you take that act of that feeling of empathy of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes that made you love reading, and then you pump it up and it becomes writing, right? Where you're the one actually creating the words. So to some extent, I'd say books, which would mean my mother, because she was my book enabler. The bookmobile ladies who used to hide books under the seat for me so they'd still be there when they got to my stop. And but the big push for me was actually my first grade teacher. Her name was Mrs. Alsdorf, and she had us doing a handwriting project where we would copy poems, because this is first grade, right? So we were learning to make legible letters on the page still. And she had us copy poems. And she picked a lot of classic things like William Wordsworth, Emily Dickinson, a little bit of Shakespeare, things that had beautiful language, but nothing that was going to be shocking to the families of 6-year-olds.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And we would just copy them in our prettiest handwriting and draw on the margins and all of that stuff. And I loved that project so much. And I gushed to her about how much I really liked the poems. And she said to me, if you wanted to, you could write your own poems. And I was flabbergasted. It had not occurred to me that I could just write them.
Yeah.
And I wrote a lot of them, some really, really bad ones, some somewhat charming ones, eventually some decently successful ones. But that's, Mrs. Osdorf and her handwriting poetry project, I think, was one of my big pushes towards a writing life.
I love that. And any teachers out there, see, you do matter. It does
Oh,
make a difference.
absolutely.
I had so many teachers that were really supportive as well. And, those little notes when you turn something in, those little scribbles, that say, great job, or I love this part. I don't think teachers realize how much that means. I had a essay I did in, I think, ninth grade. And same thing, we just had to write something. And I wrote a story. And my teacher just wrote those little notes. And I remember how much that meant to me. Like, she was like, I can't, how did you come up with this idea? This is really awesome. And like that really like kind of kept me going, because like I fantasized about being a writer. I knew I liked writing, but, wasn't really committed. And all of a sudden, those little notes made me think, I can do this. Like this
Yeah.
is something I can do. And I love that it's a teacher that was kind of that person for you too, because it is so important to understand, like there are so many people that play into children's lives to get
Mhm.
them to where they are as adults, so that, and you remember her name, which is awesome. I don't think I can remember anybody in first grade name-wise. So that really
Well,
means
she did have a cool name. I mean, she's the
it is
only
a cool
Alsdorf I've
name.
ever met.
All right, and so this is gonna go to the third question in this because I had 3 that I wanted. So who is your first hero? And it can be somebody not related to writing, it could be a superhero, it could just be somebody, but who is somebody that, like, like you have that Wonder Woman kind of person in your life, which for
Mhm.
me is Wonder Woman, but who is yours?
As a child, I really, really looked up to my Uncle John. My Uncle John is my mother's youngest brother, and in the tradition of those post-war families, there's you know lots of kids, and so my mom, as the eldest, was quite a bit older than him, and he was still a kid when he became my uncle. He was like,
Right,
I don't
yeah.
know, 7 or 8 years old when I was born. So he really felt as much as anything like an older brother or a cousin, but he was my uncle.
Right, right, yeah.
Yeah. And he had a really big group of friends who were all into things like D&D and Lord of the Rings and going to ride roller coasters and listening to music in the dark with weird lights on the ceiling. And I thought, that this is awesome. I want to be
Cool.
just like my Uncle John. So I definitely had some hero worship for him as a child.
What's crazy is I have brothers that are older or older than the age difference between you and your uncle. So yeah, he definitely fell into that kind of like brother phase, and yeah, brothers can definitely get you into trouble. So yeah, and I was going
Yeah.
to just share. Elizabeth said her sixth grade teacher insists that 2 poems I wrote for a class assignment should be published in the school newspaper, and I was hooked.
Oh,
Yeah,
I love that.
yeah, me too.
Yeah.
That's super
Yeah.
super awesome.
I had
So
similar in elementary school. After I really got into writing poetry, I would write occasional poetry, like where you write it for an occasion.
sure, yeah.
Um, and I had a little entrepreneurial thing going where I would write like Mother's Day poems that you could give to your mom and you could pay me in candy.
And their mothers were like, "This is amazing," and yeah.
They never knew.
They never know. That's awesome. Okay, so now we've kind of talked about how you started to get there. When did you know that you wanted to be a writer? Like, when did you say beyond like kind of, I guess, scribbles? Because we all have that. I think a lot of kids kind of dabble in art and they dabble in writing. But when did you know that this was something you really wanted to pursue?
Well, I was interested from a very early age, and in the sense of a writer is a person who writes. I've been a writer since I could, like since I was able to form letters on a page. But so far as like pursuing it as a career, I went through ups and downs about that. When I was a teenager, I was like, yeah, I'm going to do this. And my best friend and I wrote a really bad tennis romance novel together, and I was going to do this. And then I went to college and I took creative writing classes, which I found enlightening and discouraging at the same time. And I don't wish to put down the creative writing program I studied in because I had a great experience. I learned a lot, but it slowed me down, I think, because the focus was on literary fiction. And if you had ideas that were more in the speculative realm, which those are the kinds of stories I've always been drawn to, there just wasn't the same kind of support for it. And so, so after college, I'd write it, but I wasn't having as much fun as when I wrote that bad tennis romance or all those spooky stories or anything. So I'd come in and out, but I never left entirely. I always had a writing group. I always at least dabbled. And then I turned 42. I know, I'm still upset about it. And 42 was that, how different birthdays are crisis birthdays for people. Some people freak out when they turn 30, some people freak out when they turn 21, right? None of my other ages had bothered me in the least, but when I turned 42, Douglas Adams taught me that that is the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. Right? And it hit me hard, and I was like, you keep saying you want to be a writer. If you want to be a writer, you need to actually do it. And so I committed at that point to a daily writing habit. And I know daily writing doesn't work for everybody, but I'm kind of all or nothing on things I do. It kind of has to be every day or not at all. I'm not good at something that I only do on Wednesdays or only when the moon is full. It has to be really regular to keep me doing it. And so I committed to a daily writing habit, started finishing things, started submitting things, and I'd say that's the real start is when I
Yeah.
turned 42 and felt like Douglas Adams was watching me.
I love that because I actually had a similar kind of epiphany point. Now, when I look back at birthdays, that freaked me out for some reason. 25 freaked me out, but 50 didn't. Like when I hit 50, I was like, I kind of hit that epiphany of like, okay, if I say I'm a writer, I have to write. Like I have to do this, and that was that moment for me too, where I was like, I've got to commit now. There's no like I'd always made excuses. Well, the kids are little, I'm busy, work, etc. And all of a sudden, 50, the kids were grown, and I was still working, but I was like, what is really my excuse? Part of it was just I hadn't sat down and started. And I think
Right.
that's such an important thing. And you said like you do the daily writing. I think we have to figure out what's going to keep us moving. I'm also somewhat of a daily writer or editor, depending on what phase I'm in at the time. But yeah, I think having kind of a structure or a commitment to your process is really important because it's really easy to let the day slip by. And we're both older, so we know that. Like it's really easy to be like, okay, well, tomorrow, or I have to when the kids did this, or I have to go to the grocery store. So next week, and then next week becomes next month and next year, and then 10 years have gone by, and you're like, what am I doing? So
Right.
I love that you kind of said that same thing. And I think for a lot of people, it's not knowing how to start when there's been that gap, you
Right.
know?
For me, I started with a big meeting with my family because see, when I was 42, my youngest was 7. Still pretty little. I That's more math than I could do in my head real quick, but still pretty little. And so if I was going to write, I was going to need time. I was going to need to be left alone. And so I had a big meeting with my family, and at first I couldn't write at home because even if they tried really good to leave me alone, I would still hear what was going on in the household, right? And I'd know where the cup was that the youngest was looking for, or I would be able to help with that homework, and it
Yeah.
was really hard to, not give in to my family love part of myself and say, "Oh, the writing can wait. Let's go help with that math homework." So I would pack up my laptop and go to the library and work at the library a lot, or sometimes coffee shops. Although I found out quickly caffeine late in the day is a bad idea. So I go to the coffee shop and not have coffee. um, but as my kids got older and I had more of a habit, then I could fall in and it didn't matter. Even if my husband was in charge in the house or the kids were old enough to be in charge and I heard a glass break, I didn't necessarily come running because they could handle it, and if they couldn't handle it, then they would come get me. Like, yes, there's
Yeah.
always
And absolutely. Yeah. I was going to say the
That's
same
true.
thing.
They're all fine. Everybody's quiet, doing their own thing. You sit down to write, and then it's like, "Mom."
Where's my shoe? I need my homework. Yes. Can you sign this field trip form? Yeah. I went through the same thing. Yeah. Because it's like they seem to notice when you're like, and part of it is maybe even their need of you. It's like that kind of confirmation that you'll be there. So yeah, I ran into those similar things. And I think for me, unfortunately, I didn't do this. Like I didn't do what you did. I wasn't smart enough to say, okay, hey, I'm gonna need this or I'm gonna step away, and
Mhm.
so it definitely delayed that aspect for me as well. So once you got started, you were 42, you started writing. Was this the first book you wrote, The Going Through the Change?
No. I'd been I had really bad postpartum depression after my youngest child was born. I scared my husband a little bit, and he knew me well enough, to know that something that pulls me out when I'm low is writing, is creative endeavors. And we had just moved to Chapel Hill. We hadn't been married very long, even though we'd known each other many, many years. And he said, "What you need is a writing group." And so we did some looking around, I forget which one of those apps we found it in. There were several at the time, like Gather, Meetup, those kinds of apps that are like where you find groups that are doing
Right.
something in an area near you, right? So on one of those, we found a group, which is a writing group I still participate in. We call ourselves Works in Progress, and they were a novel writing group at the time. I had never written a novel or anything very long. I was a poet and essayist who had tried some short stories and not done well at them.
Yeah.
But once I started working with these people, I really loved it, and so I thought, okay, I'm going to learn to write a novel. And so I started, I think, 3 novels with the group before I found one that I could stick with,
Yeah.
that I didn't just get stuck and be like, there's not enough here
Yeah.
to right? Um, so the 3rd or the 4th one was a women's fiction issues kind of novel called His Other Mother, involving schizophrenia and a kidnapping and all kinds of interesting things. And I did finish that one, and even went through some submissions of it, mostly aiming at Big Five kind of publishing. Got some traction, but it never went anywhere. So now that's the trunk novel.
Okay.
And maybe someday I'll go back and do something with it, or maybe not. Like its moment might have passed in my life at this point. But I
Sure.
think that's the novel I wrote that taught me how to write a novel. And that one was so dark in a lot of ways that towards the end, the way I got myself to finish it was to promise myself that afterwards I could write something fun. And while I was still finishing that darker novel, I had the idea for what became the menopausal superheroes. And so
Okay.
that's what I started writing after that. And I guess, maybe in part because I had so much fun writing it, it found traction. Oh, also I changed who I was submitting to, because these are still trad published, but they're with small publishers.
Right. Right.
And I when I started submitting this book, I only submitted to small publishers. I didn't go for the big 5 anymore, because I found it really frustrating to wait like a year for a non-specific no that
Right.
didn't even give you any information about why they didn't want it or help you in any way. I'm like, if you're just going to say no, couldn't you have said no 9 months ago?
Right. Yeah.
Right. Then I could
Forever.
have asked
And there's
someone
ones that
else. Yeah.
there's ones I've still never heard back from. So yeah, because I did the
Yeah.
same. Like I'm now indie published, and I had small publishers, but I had also tried the trad and the same thing, or like agents, and I'm like, I think there's still ones that have never replied to me 4 years later. So it's just like
Right. Yeah.
I'm assuming that's a no. I moved on.
At a
So,
certain
so
point, it's a no from me, even if they
right,
answer.
I've
I'm
moved on.
like, excuse
Thanks,
me.
but no thanks. Yeah. So you wrote these menopausal books, and so they're with Falstaff, correct?
They are now. Yes. That's not how they started, though.
So how did they start?
So, in 2015, they were picked up by a company called Curiosity Quills, which has since imploded in, I guess you can't implode in a ball of fire. So imploded into a black hole.
Okay. A vacuum.
It was one of those cases with, the charitable explanation, and the one that I genuinely believe, is that they overextended, right? They took on more than they could manage. And then as things started to fall apart, they made some bad choices about how they managed that. In terms of transparency and communication, and what they let drop and what they didn't let drop. And so, a few years into that, when they had published 3 of the novels, they were clearly falling apart. I ended up having a book launch party at which I did not have books,
Ooh,
because they had not produced them on the schedule that they said that they would. And I was still getting my royalties, but some of the other authors were not. And so I asked for my rights back, and by then I knew John, who
okay.
runs Falstaff Books, because I'd been doing conventions and things. And he knew about this because it wasn't just me. There were other writers who had been with Curiosity Quills. And he came to me and said, if you decide you would like to work with a publisher again when you get your rights back, that he'd be interested in publishing them. And I still wasn't ready to go indie.
Yeah.
And for me, it's not a stigma thing or anything like that. It's literally about time. Like, I looked at indie publishing and I realized how much I would have to learn or hire, or, and I didn't see how I could do it alongside my teaching life and my young children. Now that's changed for me now. When we talk about what I'm going to do in the future, my next project, I intend to be my first all indie project, and I'm
Oh,
actually really excited about it because my youngest is 17 now,
yep.
and this is a better moment for me to take on some of that learning that I didn't feel like I could take on 10 years ago.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also it's really starting to fine tune, which is nice because I mean I did indie publish back in like 2005, and then I did
Right.
it again into
That's the
till
wild, wild west there.
2021. Yeah, and a completely different world. I mean, nothing was the same. It was like literally relearning everything because what had existed back then, first of all, didn't exist anymore, but what existed now was so much better. Oh my gosh, so much better. Like the tools, the apps, the information out there is amazing. I do want to give
Right,
a shout out.
and I've got a lot of friends and organizations like this one where, Go Indie Now, where I can get resources and support.
Yeah.
So, I feel like, this is a good moment to learn everything I need to learn.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I just want to give a shout out too to John and Falstaff because, I went through very similar experiences. I had 3 different contracts fall through, one including a publisher who stopped communicating, stopped paying, and we had to go through the Authors Guild to get our rights back.
Oof.
I was so burned after that. I was afraid of any publisher. I mean, I'll be honest, like I thought they're all bad over these years and as I've met different publishers like John, there's some amazing ones out there. And I do want to say that too, that, when you look at like what John does with Falstaff, he's really attentive. He's putting out quality work. He really treats his authors with respect. And I want to just give that shout out too, because I think there's a lot of writers that are like, it's either like, okay, trad five or only indie, but there are some amazing smaller presses out there. And John's kind of a medium one to me. I feel like he's, like you said,
Right, I think it still gets qualified as a small press
yeah,
because it's not a big 5, but
right.
for a small press, it's pretty big.
Yeah, he's doing amazing work. So I'm glad that you were able to sync up with him and yeah, if anybody out there doesn't know them, check out their books because I love that they're unique too. Because a lot of presses fall into the trad five mentality of it has to be mass market, it has to be this. It's unique to find a publisher who's willing to look at stories like, say, Going Through the Change, which is definitely a different type of story, and be open-minded about that. So
Yeah.
that's really awesome. And so at this point, you have how many books and how many novels and how many novellas?
The Menopausal Superheroes is 5 novels, 5th one coming out this summer. 5th one's not out yet. 2 novellas and a collection of shorts.
Nice, nice, very good.
Yeah.
And are you still sticking with your like daily writing routine? Like, is that something you still do? Like, I'm just going to get up and I'm gonna write, or how do you write? Do you write in the morning? Do you write in the evening?
It usually happens in the evening. On the weekends, sometimes I get to write in the morning, and that's what I'd actually prefer, but I like things like cars, groceries, a roof over my head, and so I have to have a day job.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Yeah, and though I've left teaching, and leaving teaching helped, because teaching is demanding in a different way than other jobs. Um, so once I left teaching and I now work for Fidelity Investments as a content strategist. That's my day job.
Okay.
It doesn't drain me like teaching does. It's challenging enough to be interesting. It pays better than teaching. That part's nice. Um, but it keeps me in house and home, but still leaves me with some of me to have for my writing life. So generally on a weekday, my writing life is after supper. So 7 o'clock ish, as long as I can stay awake, which
Yeah.
unfortunately is not very long these
No, me
days.
either. I'm
I
like,
turn into a pumpkin at like 10 o'clock.
yeah, yeah. It's not 10 o'clock is late. Like I'm like, but 9 o'clock, I'm like, I think I'm turning it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It doesn't matter anymore. I'm not trying to impress anybody. I'm tired. I'm going to bed. So yeah. So you write, and what genre would you say Going Through the Change and your books fall into?
Well, the menopausal superheroes are superhero. That's
Mhm.
kind of its own genre.
Yeah.
It gets kind of flip-flopped around in science fiction and fantasy because, it's neither and both.
Yeah.
Um, You know, I offer explanations for why people have superpowers, but of course people can't really have superpowers. So it's not the same as like Andy Weir offering explanations of what happened on Mars and
Yeah.
saying things that plausibly could happen.
Right.
There's nothing that makes the entire concept of my book plausible, but I do bother to get to offer a comic book level kind of explanation, or as we call it, hand wavium. So they're kind of their own category. My other work, when I'm doing short stories, I'm all over the place. Like I've written some science fiction, I've written a lot of horror, I've written dark fiction, a mystery story, some fantasy, a ghost story. You know, it's really just about whatever strikes me in the moment, you know, what I'm interested in. I'm working on one right now called Meanwhile in Transylvania, which I think is going to be a kind of comedy horror.
I like that.
Yeah. Um, so all over the place there. And then my next project, like the thing, once I turned in the last book, that was my last thing I was under contract for. So that meant I could write anything, and
Right.
that's terrifying and wonderful at the same time. It can be hard to keep my ADD brain focused when I don't have that external deadline holding me.
Yeah.
But I guess over the years of meeting these deadlines and getting these books published, I've developed a discipline that will work for me because I have been successful at writing since then. I'm working on a set of romances. um they're going to be Gen X romances, meaning that there are people in their 50s falling in love.
It
And
happens. We exist.
yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I've drafted two of them completely, and I'm working on the third one now. And I plan to make them my first indie project. And I'm super excited about all of that. And I
So you
also have a gothic romance on my back burner, a historical fiction trilogy on my back burner, a young adult, you know, I want to write everything.
so do you write more than one thing at a time, or do you say write one thing and kind of work on others, but not actually write them?
I usually have the thing that is what I'm working on right now.
Mhm.
And then if I can't make progress on that day, I have something else I'm allowed to play with.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I like that.
Right. And because, you know, it's that balance between giving yourself grace and holding yourself accountable. You need both because sometimes you really can't move forward. You have to fill the well first. And it's, you know, it's not going to do you any good to try to force your way through. So working on something else, I anthropomorphize my work. I'll be like, well, if the novel's not cooperating, I'm going to cheat on it with this little horror story, and then it's going to get jealous and it'll start talking to me again.
That's so funny, and he does talk to you. I don't think people really realize that, like, I'll with ideas, I do this thing where I usually work on one project at a time, but I won't start it until it has talked to me enough that I know it won't shut up.
Right.
I think a lot of people are just like, "It sounds like I have mental illness," but it's not, it's just that that's how my brain works, like, in order it has to be the point where, like, the characters have developed enough of a strength, or maybe the plot has that it's like, "Hey, I know you're over here doing the dishes, but I wanna do this." And I'm like,
Right.
"Okay, fill a minute," or I can't sleep and I have to pull out my little notepad and I have to scribble it down. That's why I was asking if you write more than one thing at a time. I don't write more than one thing at a time, but I'll brainstorm more than one thing at a time.
Right.
And
I'll let myself make notes. You know,
yeah,
like I have an idea and I'm like, okay, I'm not following you right now, but I'll jot this down so that I don't forget about you. And then you get into the back burner
yeah,
pile, and we'll see when I get there, you know, when I finish with what I'm on now, who wins, who gets it's like getting to the top of the to be read pile, right?
yeah.
There's, I don't
That's
know, 90,000 books in that pile.
yeah,
and and everything I read only adds to the pile because reading it makes me want to read everything else that person wrote,
yep.
or this other thing that's supposed to be kind of similar, or yeah.
How much would you say that you scrap? Like, when you're coming up with ideas at first, how many of those actually come to fruition and how many of those kinda end up in the pile?
Hmm. I think I think I'm better at this point at knowing which ones are worth starting. Like I've got a feel for which ones have enough to them to become something. And so, I'll play with something for a couple of paragraphs,
Mhm.
and that's enough for me to tell if it's real,
Yeah.
right? And if in those couple of paragraphs nothing's really grabbing me, then nothing's going to grab a reader either. And I should just say, well, that was a weird little thought you had. You should just let that one go.
Yeah, I have a lot of those too, that I usually don't even get to the point of writing them. It's like I just can't get them to gel enough
Mhm.
to start putting it together. So I have this idea, and I'm like, "This idea is good at first," but then, like, because I always let things brew. So, like, I'll get an idea, let it kinda simmer, and if it starts to, grow and come together, then I might go with it, but so much just fizzles out. Like, that's a
Right.
good idea, but then, like, it never really gets past that point, and so it just becomes a scrap. So,
Well, and
yeah.
I think that's what was going on as I was trying to learn to write a novel, right? I started 3 or
Mhm.
4 of them that there just wasn't enough there, and
Yeah.
but I didn't know enough about how to tell if there's enough meat there to make a whole meal or not.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
All of our cooking analogies.
Yeah, maybe I'm hungry, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's funny. But you said something earlier, and it made me kinda think. You were talking about empathy, and it made me start to wonder, to a degree, if part of what makes a really good writer is empathy, and what do you think about that? Like, do you think that's something that, and maybe even for yourself looking back, that helped you be able to develop characters better, or even books you read, do you find that you can tell if the author is more empathetic?
Yeah, I absolutely feel like empathy is essential. If I can't put myself in their situation and imagine what they must be feeling and what their fears are and how this is going to hit them, then I'm not going to be able to write it very well. And books that I end up not finishing, a lot of times that's what's going on, is like interesting plot, interesting world building, interesting concept. I don't care about any of these people, because they don't feel like people on the page. Yeah. So I'd say empathy is really central to the whole thing. And if you the only way I think my empathy hurts me in my writing is that sometimes I get so attached to my characters that I don't want to hurt them.
Yeah.
And that's why my critique partners are so important, because they'll be like, Samantha, you're being too nice to these people. This is boring. It was like when I started writing the romances I was talking about, my future project, the first draft of the first one, there's like 0 tension. Like, it's clear from the first page that these guys are made for each other. They're going to get together. There's no doubt that they're going to get together. And I'm not trying to make it like a high drama, very angsty thing, but it's not an interesting story if there's no obstacles they have to overcome.
Right.
But I liked them and I wanted them to get together. And
Yeah.
so, so, in the
You know,
second draft, there's a
people
little
like those
tension.
will they, won't they? They like that tension, so yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Well, it's so funny because I never really thought about it until you said that, and I started thinking, interesting, because I've often heard the conversation come up, which talks about, what's more important, plot or characters, which it's a weird question to begin with, but I think that character development is so important to actually making a story that the reader can connect to. So no matter how good the plot is, if people don't connect to the characters, then they don't really connect to the plot. And then that kind of made me think about the empathy thing you said. So I was like, oh, that's interesting, because I wonder how many writers are actually super empathetic, and that's why their characters are so relatable. And so when you said that, I was like, huh, that's kind of an
Well,
interesting.
that fits. Like,
Yeah.
people talk all the time about how the writing community, if there's such a thing as the writing community, right? But when you're among writers, they're largely great people. They're really generous. They want to help you. They're willing to share. And I think, if you're able to take some kind of poll of all writers and figure out where we are psychologically, I bet you'd find a whole lot of us are very empathetic folks.
I think so. Yeah. And I think even when you're reading a story, and maybe if you are reading a story where you can't connect to those characters, that may be an element that kind of plays into it too, is that and I'm not criticizing that, right? But maybe they don't have that empathy to be able to kind of put themselves into their character's shoes. Like for me, a character is a person. Like there's
Right.
somebody that could live night. Like I mean, I really feel like they're real by the time I'm done, and I'm sad. I'm sure most people feel this way. You're kind of sad when you're finally done with that character, and it's over.
Mhm.
If it's a standalone or a trilogy or a series, whatever, and okay, I'm officially done. I think when you've really developed that character, you feel this genuine sense of almost grief of letting them go. You know,
Right. Oh, and even worse if they have to, like, die in the
yeah,
story
that's
or something. Oh, no.
oh yeah, I've definitely cried. And then why
No,
am I
no,
such a
don't kill my imaginary friends.
mad at myself for doing what I'm doing?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I wanted to bring into this show, kind of a new thing, because one of the things I found fascinating last season was talking about marketing, because I think that that is a challenge a lot of writers face. And so I wanted to talk to each writer and kind of get an idea of like, one, when you first kind of put out books, where did you feel like you failed? First of all, like kind of like when you weren't getting where you needed to go. And what are some marketing tips that you kind of learned along the way that you think would be beneficial for other people to know?
So, I think a lot of people get frustrated because they're looking for something that will work quickly and work big. And if it exists, I haven't found it.
Yeah.
I feel like marketing is this long, slow build, right? And so you put the best version of you and your work out there. You give a good show even if there are only two people in the audience, and you're gracious and appreciative of any attention that you get, and slowly over time you build an audience. And I know that's frustrating.
No,
There
smart.
there are there are people who get into writing, I think, thinking that it's a quick trip to fame and fortune. And
It's
first
not.
off, I don't actually want to be famous. I wouldn't mind if my books got famous and, like, they decided to make movies out of them and I make enough money to have a trip to New Zealand or something. That would be great. But I myself do not actually want to be famous. I would like to continue to walk down the street and the only people who know me are people I used to teach.
Yeah.
That's my level of fame. And so developing a readership, I think, is a longer, slower game. And you can't, if you're serious about it, you have to allow for that slow build.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, and I agree, and it's funny because like, my husband and I have a writer friend, and when I had taken a hiatus, I hadn't written for 15 years, and during that time, one of our friends got published, and he said one day, he goes, "Well, how much money do you think she makes?" And I started laughing, and she has a publisher, a small publisher, and I just said, "None." Like, and he's like, "Seriously?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "You're not in it for that reason. There are those few people that make money at it, make good money at it, and there's some people that make money at it, and then there's some people like I think where I'm at, where I make enough to keep going and do events and things like that. But I'm not in it for that. And I think that was something that, talking to a lot of writers, there's ones that really struggle with that because they want to be big and they want to be famous. They want to make a living at it.
Mhm.
And that's understandable. But I think one of the things about writing is if you're going to continue doing it, you don't want to burn yourself out with your own fantasies of like
Right.
like, because then you're like, "Oh, it's not happening. Maybe I'm no good." Well, that has no bearing on it whatsoever. And I think that that's why one of the reasons I wanted to talk to writers about marketing, because I wanted other writers to hear that,
Mhm.
like, this has a lot to do with building readership. And you build readership by writing a good story, by being a
And
good
then doing it again, and then
and then
doing it
doing it
again.
again, and then and putting yourself out there, like, letting people get to know you a little bit. I
Yeah.
do events, and I actually sell a lot more books at events than say I do online. Do you sell Where do you feel like your sales come from?
I feel like I get the most bang for my buck, so to speak, at in-person events.
Yeah,
You
me
know,
too.
doing conventions. I've had a lot of people who I talk to on panels, and they find me interesting enough that then they'll come talk to me about my books, or something I say connects with them, or or just because I was on the panel with this more famous person, they heard about my book,
Yeah.
and they become interested. Um, I have a okay following on a few different kinds of social media, but on social media, I feel like that's not really a selling place. It's like, that's a connecting place.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I'll put out like, look at this cool plant I saw on my walk today. This is the book I've been reading. And there'll be writer stuff in there. I'll be like, ugh, don't you hate it when your character changes the plot on you in the middle? You
Yep.
know? But too many buy links all the time. Nobody wants that.
Nobody
That's
wants
not
that.
why readers came to social media either. They came to connect, right? And so I just try to put myself out there, who I genuinely am, my authentic self, and trust that there are other people who would be interested in me and what I have to produce. And it's just a matter of finding each other. I do think there's some, it can be the where I am right now, I feel like my writing life pays for itself, like it's self-perpetuating. I make enough money at it make enough money at one thing to pay for the next thing and so on, but not a lot goes into my pocket. Um and I would like it to be a little more than that, but it's it's not going to happen all of a sudden, likely. The chances that I get that stroke of lightning will hit me and I will suddenly be the it girl that everybody is talking about with the book. That's small possibility.
Yeah, yeah, and that's not probably what drives you, it's not what drives me, and, for me, putting out every time a good story comes to my mind, like, that's what drives me is the ability to take these weird random things in my head, the voices in my head, and make them into an actual story. That's what drives me because there's something very satisfying of doing that, like, that whole process,
Yeah.
and going, "Wow, all of that kind of" it's like a pinball machine in my head. Like,
Well, my
it's
oldest daughter is a songwriter, not for a living, because
Mhm.
who makes a living at that? But
Right.
she's a songwriter, and she talks about songwriting for her being a kind of alchemy, a transmutation, where you take all the things that are in you and you transform them into this piece of art to put out there. And I love that, and it fits for me too. I always say I'm always writing about what frightens me, right? This is how I process. And so going through the change is lighthearted, optimistic, even funny, at least at times. It amused me anyway. Hopefully it amuses other people. But um, the impetus to write it came from things that bother me, about the way people treat women as they age, the way my body treats me as I age, dang
Yeah.
her. Just because I've ignored her for the past 50 years, what does she have to say about it now? I mean, really. And so it's processing life. Writing is how I process. There's a quote from, I think it's E.M. Forster. Is it, how do I know what I think until I see what I say? And I feel that in writing, that like I can't articulate it directly. I have to kind of transform it into a piece of art, and then I will know.
Totally, and I think that also comes, like, with, like, inspiration. People say, "Where do you get your ideas?" Well, I think that's part of it too, is being in tune to, like, that aspect of yourself, to be
Mhm.
able to take those kind of random little things and then take it and turn it into an idea, which you definitely did. Because again, it's so unique. I really love the idea of it because I can see where it came from a place probably within you and then just grew into itself.
Right.
And that's really cool. And I think a lot of people would relate to that as well. Okay, well, we're coming close to the end of the show, and I wanted you to be able to kind of talk a little bit again about your books, any upcoming events you have, where people can purchase your books, things like that.
All right. So, you can find me online at samanthabryant.com. If you Google me, just put Samantha Bryant author. Because if you don't put the author part, what you'll get is an actress who's married into the Hanks family. I
Okay.
don't think you'll get as confused.
Yeah.
I'm usually not in a ball gown. Um, but just in case, I'm Samantha Bryant, the author, not
Yeah.
the actress. She's also like young enough to be my daughter, I think.
You get, if you just type in Juliet Rose, you get a very expensive flower. So yes, I have to say this a million. It's author.
Yeah. Yeah. Juliet Rose, the author. I'm
Yes,
not actually a
I'm not a
flower.
flower.
And we've been talking mostly about my menopausal superhero series, which I'm super excited to have completed now. And it will be available. The last book is called Change for the Better, and it will be available in June. It's going to be released as part of Con Carolinas. Con Carolinas is a big convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, which don't tell the other conventions, but it's my favorite convention. I think the reason it's my favorite is not that there's anything wrong with any of the others. I have a good time at a lot of conferences and conventions, but at Con Carolina seems to be where all the different threads of my writing life come together. And so people that I know from over here and over here and over here all come to Con Carolinas. And it's like this one weekend where I get to see everybody. And it's really nice for me in that way. I think that's why that one's my favorite.
That's very cool. Now, do you have a website or anything like that?
Yes. So my name is my website, samanthebryant.com, because I can't keep track of too many extra things. So I just named it after myself. It's easy. And from there you can there's a little sidebar. My website, please don't judge my ability to be a creator based on my website. It was once upon a time a mommy blog, right? And then it kind of morphed to become my website. Having a better website is one of those things that's on my list for someday. But when my writing life fits in 2 hours a day, someday probably will be after I retire.
Definitely.
Yeah. But yes, there's a little sidebar where you can sign up for my newsletter. There's links to all my social media. I at least play on a lot of social media, and my name on most social media is Samantha B. Writer, just the letter B in the middle.
Very cool. Well,
Yeah.
this has been a really fun chat. I've really liked talking to you. And we appreciate you coming on and being part of First Time for Everything. And we just want to remind our listeners that it's always time for Go Indie Now. And we appreciate you tuning into the show. And welcome back, y'all.